Dear students, it is impossible to fully understand the history of the Kazakhs without knowing fundamental principles of organization of the Mongol Empire, its customs, political traditions, power reproduction, and authority inheritance. The early Kazakh Khanate, and we will discuss this political formation in a subsequent lecture, was one of the successor states of the great Mongol Empire, which inherited most of its important features. The Mongol Empire came to existence as a conglomerate of Turkic and Mongol-speaking tribes in the heart of Eurasia that led nomadic way of life and were highly dependent on the sedentary cultures around them. In the early 13th century, these nomadic pastoralists, under leadership of Genghis Khan and his descendants, managed to create the largest overland empire in the world history. By 1280, it stretched from the Black Sea to the Sea of Japan, from Lake Baikal to Hainan, for the first time in history and for the last time in history, integrating Russia, Persia, and China into one united political entity. Even after gradual disintegration, the empire continued to exist in the forms of multiple successor states that were based on the same principles laid down by Genghis Khan himself or even his ancestors. Our today's lecture will focus on the following three issues. What is authority and how individuals, groups and states legitimize their claims for power? Who are nomads and what are peculiarities of their power legitimation and reproduction? And how the institutes and traditions of power laid down by Genghis Khan determined subsequent history of Central Eurasia. So what is authority? According to Cambridge English Dictionary, authority is the moral or legal right or ability to rule and control. It was eminent German sociologist Max Weber who highlighted legitimacy as the key to authority. States' legitimacy, Weber argued, rests on the chance that people will follow its commands as a given source of power. He thus identified three forms of authority used by a state or anyone claiming power to affirm the validity of this claim's legitimacy. Charismatic leadership, established tradition, reason, order, and law. All three forms are easily traceable in the history of the rise of the Mongols. But before we begin to discuss how these forms of authority worked in the case of the Mongols, let's talk about nomadism as a way of life and economic activity. This will facilitate our understanding of the driving force behind the Mongols' conquest. Who are nomads? Look at these pictures. To some extent, each of these groups and individuals can be labeled as nomads because their vocation or life in general implies constant or regular movements from point A to point B, be it a truck driver, a family of gypsies, aircraft crew, or motorbikers. It means that the term nomad is too general. Which term works better for identification of traditional nomadic peoples like the Mongols or Kazakhs? Right, exactly. Nomadic pastoralists. What is nomadic pastoralism? Which people can be characterized as nomadic pastoralists? As you see on this slide, they should meet the following basic requirements. Number one, pastoralism is the main form of economic activity. Number two, herds graze free range without stables year-round. 3. seasonal mobility is contained within a specific grazing territory. And 4. The entire population is mobile, not only a specific group, but the entire population. Seasonal nomadism by no means is convenient. Just imagine that at least once a year, most likely 2 or 3 times, you have to mobilize all your family, collect all your belongings and livestock and move to another place, sometimes 100 miles away. So why did people nomadize? What was the reason for this? While in the arid areas of Central Eurasia, cattle breeding offers advantages over agriculture. Harsh natural conditions with very cold, windy winters and hot, droughty summers with amazing climatic aberrations preclude raising crops effectively. One year you can have good crop, but next year your next crop can be completely destroyed. Domestication of horse, which happened in the 4th millennium before Common Era, most likely in the northern Kazakh steppe, was a very important achievement which increased mobility of some groups of the people. You need to keep in mind that transition to nomadic pastoralism was not immediate, but rather gradual process that took several thousand years. With all advantages this way of life and economic activity might offer, pastoralist economy could not be self-sufficient. The nomadic lifestyle was precarious, as their constant migrations prevented them from transporting reserves of food or other necessities. Rarely having the luxury of surpluses to tide them through difficult times, they were extremely vulnerable to the elements. Heavy snows, ice and droughts, judging from contemporary times, droughts afflicted Mongolia about twice a decade, jeopardized their flocks and herds and heightened their sense of fragility. And then, nomads did need grain and other products of sedentary societies. This determined dependence of the nomads on the sedentary societies, and this dependence often brought them to conflicts. Now let's look at the map of Eurasia. What we see in its central part, highlighted with green, is so-called Great Eurasian Steppe Belt, a huge stretch of land that goes through the central part of the continent from the Mediterranean to Pacific. Natural landscape is similar in different parts of the belt. Flat plains with sporadically scattered low hills. The belt is divided into western and eastern parts by Altai Mountains. The western part of the belt was the cradle of nomadism. Here, archaeologists find the vestiges of the earliest nomadic societies, those of Cimmerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, Kushans, Hephthalites, and others that existed in the period between the 7th century BC and the 6th century AD. Most of them inhabited the vast Kazakh steppe. Early Western nomads were Europoids, speaking various Indo-Aryan languages. We know them not only from archaeological evidence, but also from testimonies coming from accounts written by Greek, Roman, Indian, and Persian authors. For these societies, it was uneasy coexistence with the nomads. As I mentioned before, nomadic economies were not self-sufficient. Nomads were generally satisfied as long as agriculturalists agreed to trade with them. But as soon as this trade relations stopped, the nomads attacked villages and cities of their neighbors. One of these early nomads, The so-called Isik Golden Man, or Altın Adam, belonged to the people of Saka, a branch of Scythians. What about the eastern part of the belt? Seems the people that inhabited these areas borrowed nomadism as a complex technology from their western counterparts. The rise of Eastern Eurasian nomads dates back to the 2nd century BC, when Chinese chroniclers first mention the so-called Hans or Xiongnu. Hans and other nomads in the course of their history actively interacted with the mightiest agricultural society of that part of the world, China. Even before Common Era, Chinese began to construct the Great Wall to protect themselves from systematic inroads of the steppe nomads. Some eastern nomads were able to conquer various Chinese regions and establish their own dynasties. Another direction of their expansion was the western part of the belt. It were ancient Turks who, in the 7th, 8th century AD, brought under submission entire western part and assimilated those who inhabited it before them. But let us move to the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire, the greatest of all nomadic empires of both western and eastern parts of the Eurasian steppe, came to existence. So how is it possible? What was the reason for the conquest, and what was their path to success? There are many theories explaining the Mongol aggression, and all of them, in one way or another, are connected with the precarious way of life of nomads, their dependence on agriculturalists, and principles of organization of Eurasian nomadic societies. In the period from 1180 to 1220, Mongolia experienced a drop in the mean annual temperature, which meant that the growing season for grass was cut short. Less grass meant a real danger to the Mongols' animals, and since the animals were truly the basis of the Mongols' pastoral nomadic life, this ecological threat may have prompted them to move out of Mongolia. There's an alternative view based on data of dendrochronology. Recent analysis of remains of Siberian pine trees found in central Mongolia. The acquired data indicate that the regional climate during the conquest of Genghis Khan's 13th century Mongol Empire was warm and persistently wet. This period, characterized by 15 consecutive years of above average moisture in central Mongolia and coinciding with the rise of Genghis Khan, is unprecedented over the last 1112 years. Another reason might be the attempts by the Mongols' neighbors in the north and northwest China, Jin and Xia dynasties, to reduce the amount of trade with the Mongols. Being dependent on trade for goods that the Mongols desperately needed, such as grain, craft, and manufactured articles, cessation of trade, or at least the diminution of trade, could have been catastrophic and provoked the chain effect aggression. And at last, the reason of the conquest may lie in the sphere of ideology. The nomadic empires changed each other over time and may seem as discrete entities. However, all Eurasian nomads continued a long tradition in terms of their beliefs, political culture, and relationships with sedentary civilizations. Each distinct nomadic entity made contribution to this set of values and institutes. One of them is an ideology that legitimized the appearance of a super-tribal unit. Most successful nomadic leaders inevitably came to understanding that tribal affiliations and loyalties would never allow nomads to become united. They shuffled tribes, trying to break ties within and between clans, and create new types of identity. Most effective way to create new identities was through formation of military units. It were the nomadic people of Khitans who first introduced decimal principle of military organization that was later used by the Mongols. It may be surprising for many of you, but most of today's Central Asian ethnic groups were created as artificial super-tribal political identities. Kalmyks, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Uyghurs, Mongols, Manjus, etc. The powerful source of super-tribal unity in the steppe world was the belief in Tengri, heaven, the unpersonified supreme deity, conferring the right to rule on a single clan. The heavenly charisma resided in the royal clan, individual members of which could be elevated to the supreme office of the ruler, but non-members could not aspire to the throne. Genghis Khan's heroic endurance to many hardships in his early life and eventual success in unification of the disparate nomadic clans served as an evidence of his possession of charisma descended upon him from Tengri. Genghis Khan himself used to say he was protected by everlasting heaven. The Mongols were not the first people who exploited this idea, but definitely the most impressive and enduring tradition of institutionalized ancestry is the Chinggishid line. What did determine the amazing success of the Mongols? As nomads, the Mongols were professional warriors, intensely trained for warfare from early childhood. Personal skills of a Mongol warrior by far exceeded that of a warrior from a sedentary society. Effective super-tribal military organization based on decimal principle was inherited by the Mongols from earlier steppe empires. The Mongol army was divided into the units consisting consecutively of 10, 100, 1000, 10,000 warriors with mutual responsibility. Each unit was led by a responsible officer, and the head of 2 men, or 10,000, maintained strong personal relationships with Chinggis himself, reinforcing his authority over his army. As I mentioned before, the Mongol Empire started as a family venture. Genghis Khan's 4 sons, born from his first wife Borte, had rights for his power inheritance. He allotted each of them his own ulus, or domain, in line with apanash system, common to Eurasian nomads. Ulus rulers had to obey Great Khan, but in reality, cultural assimilation, rivalry, and time flow contributed to gradual increase of their independency. Chinggisids preferred lateral system of succession and combined it with merit-based principle. It means that every member of the clan could claim for power in the empire and later in a successor state, not necessarily direct offspring of the previous ruler. It could be a cousin, brother, or uncle. Merit-based succession implied the most qualified claimant would become the next ruler. It was the Kurultai, or council of tribal leaders, that had the right to assign individuals to leadership. Any direct descendant of Genghis Khan could potentially be next ruler of a Khanate, especially if he had authority among others. As I mentioned earlier, non-members of the ruling Chinggishid clan couldn't claim for leadership. Even Amir Timur, or Tamerlane, the 14th century, a mighty non-Chinggishid ruler of Central Asia, respected the Chinggishid prerogatives and never assumed Khan's title, preferring to rule through puppet Chinggishid Khans. With time, the number of potential claimants for the throne and apanash multiplied, arousing tense competition between them. Still, tracing ancestry directly to the Golden Clan was a prerequisite for claims for power in Central Asia. The largest of all appanages had been granted by Chinggis Khan to his eldest son, Juchi, probably as a compensation for passing him over in the right to inherit the title of the Great Khan. Juchi was allowed to expand his appanage by attaching to it the territories in the west he would be able to conquer. The Ulus of Juchi came into existence as a separate entity earlier and continued longer than other main Uluses. The core of the Golden Horde was the vast steppe stretching from the Irtysh in the east to the Danube in the west. By the way, the name Golden Horde seems to derive from the gold-hung palace tents, Ordo, at which Uzbek Khan received visitors and was never broadly used by the Mongols themselves. Juchi's second son, Batu, inherited the domain and expanded it to include Russian principalities, Bulgaria, Crimea, and Caucasus. Some of the conquered territories were ruled through local elites under supervision of Baskars. Like other nomadic polities, the Ulus of Juchi subsisted extracting resources from trade, cities, and sedentary economies. Although Khans of the Golden Horde remained nomadic, cities flourished across the Ulus, the biggest being Sarai, Ugek, Bishtak, Majar, Sarayshik, and Siganak. Juchi's sons further divided the steppe into strips extending along rivers from south to north. The main division was into right, western, Ak, and left, eastern, Kök hands. The right hand was controlled by descendants of Batu and Berke, while the left one by offspring of Ordu Egen, Shiban, and Tukatimur. During most of its history, continuous rivalry was happening between different Juchid lines, changing one another on the Khan's throne. The rivalry facilitated collective rule of the broader Juchid clan. Late history is the struggle for power primarily between Shibanids and Tukatimurids, and Chinggisid versus non-Chinggisid usurpers. Bekleri Beks, the highest officials in the Golden Horde after the Khan, usually represented by influential non-Chinggisid tribe leaders, could gain prominence under weaker Khans and become virtual rulers of the Juchi Ulus, like Nogai, Mamai, or Yedigey. In the period of 60s, 80s of the 14th century, Juchi Ulus entered the period of protracted political crisis, so-called Great Troubles, Velikaya Zamyatnya, the rivalry between Juchid lines with participation of some non-Chinggisid usurpers. But political disruptions alone, however strong they might be, were not responsible for the decline of the Juchi Ulus. Other factors, among which are the Black Death, decline of urban culture and trade, inflation, rise of Muscovites and the eastern nomads, local separatism, contributed much to the demise of the Golden Horde. The Black Death alone, the most devastating plague pandemic in the human history, killed from 75 to 200 million people. In the 15th century, the Ulus of Juchi ceased to exist as a political entity and divided into a few successor states, Khanates of Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, Siberia, Nogai Horde, Uzbek and Kazakh Khanates. These states were disappearing one by one up to the early 20th century as a result of Russian annexation. It can be argued that the Mongol legacy survived until late modern periods. A few common features were shared by all successor states of the Mongol Empire and Golden Horde. Among them, development of super-tribal identities, lateral seniority, and/or merit-based succession instead of one family linear succession principle, collective type of rule instead of one reigning family, subsistence through extracting resources from sedentary economies and trade, the system of appanage which divided polity into smaller districts ruled by hereditary Chinggisid noblemen. All these features were inherited by the Kazakh Khanate. In subsequent lectures, we will see how these traditions worked for the Kazakh political system and how they were deconstructed due to Russian influence in the 18th, 19th century. So far, think about the following issues. Which Mongol tradition could contribute to the three jus system of the Kazakhs? How collective rule principle influenced the history of the Kazakhs? And why Chinggisid political traditions proved to be so sustainable and endured well into late modernity? Thank you.